Alright, this is Unit 6, Lesson 3. I'm going to try and go through this one a little bit quicker because we've spent a lot of time talking about climate change throughout the year. And so particularly this lesson and the next lesson, um, I'm going to try and go through a little bit quicker. It might be a little bit more self-explanatory at this point of the year. Okay, so it has this koala. It says most of the time they live in branches of eucalyptus trees and cool coastal, low elevation forests. What physical and behavioral traits appear apparent in the photo that help it connect to its environment? So I said, it talks about them living in forests and in trees and in cool environments. So it has kind of all this fuzzy fur. It's got claws to help it climb. Its hands. Look at its hands is spread apart, so it kind of seems like it would help it climb trees really well, stuff like that. And how do you think climate change might affect the conditions in the koala's environment? So one thing I was writing about is how they seem really suited to like a cold environment with their fur and trees, and so as the environment warms, it might change the trees or make it harder for them to live. They might start like overheating, for example, because they're basically wearing a giant blanket. Okay, then this was a fill in the blank. So basically individual, an individual is a word that we use to describe a single plant. So here you have a single, I don't know, I think this is supposed to be a Joshua tree, like a small Joshua tree, because it's big in the background. So we have an individual, a Joshua tree, and then population is the word that we use to describe multiple of the same species. So this is a population, and that is multiple, um, Joshua trees here. So one Joshua tree, multiple. Then we have the community. The community is it describes it up here. These things are all described up here. All of the different species that live in an ecosystem make up a community. So this is in a particular ecosystem, right? Just like this landscape here. But now you can see how we have a Joshua tree in here, but we also have like a coyote and these other plants. So this is the community. It involves other species. Then the ecosystem as a whole is the entire area. So an ecosystem is all the living organisms and their non-living and the non-living things in the environment. So in 7th grade, actually we describe that as the abiotic and biotic. Biotic is the living things. So the ecosystem not only includes the community of all of the living things like the trees and the animal, or like the plants and the animals, but the ecosystem also includes the, what we would say, abiotic factors like the the dirt and the rocks and those types of things is all part of the ecosystem. An ecosystem cannot perform essential services that cannot perform essential services. So what is an essential service? An essential service is um, things like providing food. It says that here, clean air, water, decompose waste, regulate climate change and disease. Those are essential services. So an ecosystem that cannot perform those services is an unhealthy ecosystem, and such an ecosystem would be able to support a small population of organisms. So the more unhealthy an ecosystem is, in general, it supports a smaller population of organisms. That's because a large population of organisms would require they require food, they require clean air, they require water. So the greater population, the better the ecosystem shape has to be. So biodiversity is a measure of all of the different, it says this right here, biodiversity describes the number, type, and variety of all living organisms in a particular area. Sorry, that's being glitchy right now. So biodiversity is kind of like a term we use to describe like the diversity, how many different organisms and how different are they in a particular ecosystem. And so down here it talks about Yellowstone National Park, and it before and after wolves were introduced. So wolves at one point in time in the United States were basically completely eradicated. They were hunted almost to extinction. And then they decided that they were going to start reintroducing them in the 90s back into Yellowstone. So this is what they saw happening. So higher biodiversity, so first, higher biodiversity generally means that the ecosystem is more stable because greater variability in the number of species and in the individuals of each species mean that the ecosystem is less susceptible to environmental changes. So over here, you can see this is before wolves, so here we have 0 wolves, and then after there was 104 wolves. And so you can see some changes. So first of all, the number of coyotes decreased, the number of foxes increased. I'm comparing to the before and after. The grizzly bears increased, right? The elk greatly decreased from 17,000 to 7,000. Mule deer stayed about the same. Beaver colonies, those went way up. And we have birds. Birds went up a little bit. The cottonwood trees, this has greater than 5 centimeter diameter. So these are talking about slightly large, like large trees. So the larger trees increased, and then the shrubs also greatly increased. So you can see how maybe the foxes, grizzly bears, the beaver colonies, all these trees, most of these increased just by adding wolves, which is good because a lot of these things, right, you had in one area there was less than 5 bushes, less than 10 trees. One beaver colony, that's just a handful of beavers. Um, and you had thousands and thousands and thousands of elk. So what the wolves did was the wolves prey primarily on elk, and elk primarily eat bushes and plants. And so there were so many elk in the park that they were eating all the trees, the small trees, before they could grow. They were eating the bushes, and what that was doing is that was negatively impacting all of the other animals. So the grizzly bears didn't have as much food to eat because they also eat berries and things like that. The 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 coyotes did decrease in their population, probably because they also prey on the elk, but foxes increased, and there's still a lot of coyotes. And so introducing the wolves really created a lot greater biodiversity because just having the wolves there to kill off some of the elk allowed a lot of the plants and the trees to grow back, which started impacting the other animals as well. So, based on the data in the table, how do wolves affect the biodiversity and stability of the ecosystems of Yellowstone National Park? And so, wolves in the park make the ecosystem, less stable? This is not the right one. I don't know why. No, that's all right. Wrong. I don't know why I circled that because it's definitely not the right answer. So wolves make the park more stable because biodiversity increased after the wolves were reintroduced. This first one isn't true. They don't change the stability of the park. They definitely changed the stability. Look, everything changed. Wolves make the park less stable because, so this is not true because, yes, the populations of elk and coyotes went down, but overall, a lot of other organisms increased, and there's still a lot of uh, coyotes. Actually, and foxes went up. Or sorry, coyotes went down and elk went down, but there's still thousands of elk and there's still lots of coyotes. Wolves make the park ecosystem less stable because after their reintroduction, population of all these animals went up. So an ecosystem is more stable with greater populations, right? That kind of goes back up to here. A healthy ecosystem supports a larger number of organisms. So that's not true. All right, adaptations. So lots of different things have adaptations. Here's an example of adaptations. Rabbits with super large ears. You got these tarantula hawks, which I'm pretty sure are like wasps, types of wasps, or they're related to them, I think. Actually, maybe this might be ants, actually. The cactus wren that lives in these cactuses, the adaptations. They have different adaptations. Then how might eucalyptus trees and koalas be adapted to the local environment conditions where they live? So I said that eucalyptus trees probably have lots of leaves because they're in cooler environments. Koalas are obviously adapted to live in the local environments because they have that fur to keep them warm and the claws to help climb the trees. And so there you go. And then we have this kelp forest. So we need to make a line graph right here talking about these different kelp forests. And the thing I said about the kelp forest is you can see how the ones that are closer to the surface, like all of these ones, right? These are all closer to the surface, and they kind of just have the leaves. But these ones that are deeper, some of them that are deep, like this one and this one, they have these long stalks. So the stalks go way up, and then they have the leaves just near the surface. And the giant kelp is a little different because it's just really long and it has leaves all throughout. But you can see how these leaves are actually smaller, you know? So it has lots of small leaves, and then these ones have really large leaves in comparison, but they have like a stalk that brings they have less leaves that are bigger, and they're just near the surface. So you kind of get the idea of what I was describing there, I hope. And then you had to just make a line graph and plot where they were for their height. So, 0 to 40 meters, because 0 to 40 meters. And so then the elk kelp was about, 38 or so. Giant was a little bit more than 35, maybe 35-ish, wherever, I'm estimating. So that's the line graph. Circle the areas in the map where the glaciers have changed. Oh, I did on the second one. So here's the picture. You have the glaciers. And so you can see that the glaciers are this dark, it's like this dark grayish color. And the lighter blue color is, I guess I could zoom in more, is the water. And it appears gray, obviously, because it's further down, and so it's got dirt and stuff on it. It's not up high. It's like, when you go to the snow and the snow's a little dirty. So here you can see where it's receded. So, it was once, this gray was once covering all this water. So these glaciers have receded a whole bunch. So ice and snow reflect more. How does the melting of the glacier change the transfer of the energy between the surface and the atmosphere? And what I said is, when the glaciers melt, they are revealing more land and water than before, and so it's going to absorb more sunlight, and it's going to make them melt even faster. How could the changes in the glaciers affect the local environment conditions to which the organisms are adapted? Okay, well, you can see how the glaciers have receded, so there is less glacier, more lake water. So organisms that have adapted to live in a glacier environment are losing their habitat, essentially, which is problematic because they're, losing where they can live. Let's see. Okay, so changes to land ecosystems. So this talks about some changes in land, like if there's a fire, how can that affect things? It looks like I didn't type this out. So how could climate change affect the environment in which koalas live? How could koalas respond to that change? So one thing that the climate change could do is it could change the trees. Like maybe the trees start dying off, or if there's a fire, there's nowhere for the trees to live. So how could the koalas respond to that change? Well, the koalas might need to migrate to a new habitat. They might need to adapt to be able to eat different types of plants, things like that. changes to aquatic ecosystems. So one of the changes to aquatic ecosystems that this demonstrates is that as climate change is happening, there is more acid in the water, so the water is becoming more acidic. And here's an example of how that's bad, because a lot of these organisms in the ocean, particularly shelled organisms, their shells are built out of like calcium and certain compounds, and the acids will break them down, and so it's really harmful for a lot of the organisms because they are essentially living in more acidic waters, which they're not adapted to. So climate change increases the acidity of the ocean, lake, river water. Increased acidity dissolves the shells of some marine creatures, decreasing their likelihood of survival or reproduction. There's a slab you could do if you feel so inclined. Response, adaptation, and extinction. So some small animals and most plants cannot adjust their range quickly when conditions become unfavorable. Native plants that are adapted to extremely specific habitats are especially at risk due to climate change. And essentially what this is talking about is there are lots of organisms that are really, really, like if you have a very specific habitat, if you are a plant or an animal with really specific adaptations and then climate change is affecting those organisms greater, because it takes organisms a very long time to adapt to changes, particularly if they have to do it through reproduction, because that's a slow process. So if the climate is changing faster than they can adapt, then typically they will die off because they can't adapt quick enough. So here, this talks about the evaluate extinction probability. These pages up here are talking about just how climate change and biodiversity is affecting particular animals. Then it's asking this question about so the more individuals that are in a population, this is basically this paragraph says, if there's more individuals in a population, the chances for survival are greater because they have a more genetically diverse. They're more genetically diverse because they have a greater population, so there's a greater pool of genetic diversity, and that genetic diversity, if the animals need to adapt, they have a better chance. So this talks about these birds, and it says in 2013 there are these birds, and there are 600,000 of them on the islands of Hawaii. And on some islands, the populations have dropped significantly. So on Oahu, there's only about 50 birds. And so this says, based off of the population, what's the chances that they're going to become extinct on the Hawaiian Islands? And what I said is, overall, the chance is really small because there are 600,000 birds. That's a lot of birds. So they have a big population, and so as climate change is occurring, those birds are going to be able to, birds reproduce fairly quickly, and there's lots of them. So there's probably going to be many of the birds that have traits that are better for surviving, and they will continue to reproduce and help the species survive. On Oahu, they actually might go extinct on just the island of Oahu, though, because with only 50 birds, birds are producing sexually, of course, so that's only basically like 25 pairs of birds. So the chances of 25 pairs of birds having the right adaptations that would be beneficial to them to continue on their species on that island is a lot slimmer than, say, overall 300,000 pairs. So they could go extinct on Oahu, but the chances of the whole Hawaiian Islands is pretty small. So here we go. Monitoring the effects of climate change on organisms. So coastal wetlands in California are important to ecosystems because they stabilize shorelines. Coastal wetlands are wetlands along the coast because they prevent flooding. These habitats are likely to become less stable if the populations that live in them move or become extinct in response to climate change. And so this talks about how we model climate change in effect. So we use computers a lot of times to model climate change. What factors might a computer model need to include for scientists to model the effects of climate change? So some things that computers might need to know is things you'd be pumping into computers would be things like air temperature, water temperature, the acidity of the water, the long-term weather patterns that you know of, the changes in the population, what cities are by, and pretty much anything you could think of is you're going to want to put in and include, because the more things you include, the more accurate your model would be. This is why they use supercomputers for these things, because there's tons of things that they're considering. So how do scientists gather data about organisms? You know, we can use satellites and radar, we can like track animals, we can do tests on particular animals. A lot of times, you know, scientists do large scale things like using satellites and weather radar and stuff, but then they also go into the field and will like actually track certain individuals. So how does tracking the movement of bats help scientists understand the effects of climate change? So this is particularly how do they help them understand the effects of climate change on bats? So tracking the movement shows whether the bats range, whether bats change their range based on where food is available. So would be an effect of climate change on bats. Tracking movements of bat colonies helps explain how bats fly. That doesn't have to do with climate change. Tracking movements of individual bats explains how bats use sound to navigate and communicate. Yes, but this doesn't have to do with climate change. And tracking movements of bats helps to explain why bats may change the timing of their migrations for different years. Yeah, the timing of migration could be due to climate change, so that would be D. And then at the very end we have this one. So determine whether each of these number sentences is a fact, a reasoned judgment, an opinion, or speculation. So if you go up here, you can read this for yourself, but 1, 2, 3, and 5 are facts. 4, I'll just go over these ones. 4 is an opinion, because 4 says remote sensing using satellites and airplanes is better than gathering data by visiting different locations. You know, maybe, like depending on who you are as a scientist, maybe you think that it is, maybe you'd prefer to visit the different locations. So that's an opinion. 6 is a reasoned judgment. As more technology is developed, remote sensing equipment will probably provide more detailed data for scientists to analyze. So that might be true. It could be. It could be an opinion, but it's an opinion that's based off of reasoning, because you know we know that more technology is being developed and stuff, so it probably will. So that's a reasoned judgment. And 7 is a speculation, because it is so useful. Most scientists want to include remote sensing when they plan to investigate biodiversity. That's kind of just that is an opinion, but more specifically, they're speculating that everyone wants to include it. And then last, we have this thing about the lizards and their environment and what criteria and constraints would apply to a technology that could use to monitor these lizards, and describes where they live up here. And so things I said was some criteria or things that it has to do is it needs to be able to work in hot and sandy environments. That's an example of a criteria. And a constraint is that it would need to be small and hard to notice, because they can move quickly, so then they can move quickly, but they also can burrow in the sand, so you would want to be able to follow them around and be able to monitor them and not scare them, so they would bury into the sand. So there you go.